The cartridge was empty. That was the first thing Liaison Prime Verath noted when she entered the human delegation chamber. Not the silence, not the stillness, not the faint smell of something chemical and sharp that her species' olfactory nodes registered as a warning even before her cognitive functions caught up. The cartridge. It sat on the conference table, brass-colored and small, no longer than her smallest digit, positioned exactly at the center of the table as if it had been placed there deliberately, as if it were a gift. Or a message. She had reviewed the terms herself. She had drafted 3 of the clauses. The Keth Dominion's legal archive confirmed it. 17 days ago, Earth's governing assembly had signed the disarmament accords. Every projectile weapon, every energy discharge platform, every orbital kinetic system, cataloged, surrendered, dismantled under Dominion observation. So why was there a cartridge on the table? And why were the humans smiling? The accords had not been a negotiation. That was the important thing to understand, not as political context, but as the foundational fact around which everything that followed would eventually need to be reinterpreted. The Keth Dominion did not negotiate with species that had not yet achieved Category 4 galactic standing. Earth had achieved Category 2, barely, and only because a Dominion probe had detected their radio transmissions 40 years before humans had invented the means to detect the probe in return. The relationship was therefore, from the Dominion's perspective, paternal, corrective, civilizational hygiene. The Dominion had presented the disarmament terms not as a demand but as an educational document, a formal notification of what would now occur, accompanied by a timeline that left no room for human input. The timeline was, in fact, the notification. You will disarm. You will do so within 60 standard cycles. Dominion observers will confirm compliance. What the Dominion had not anticipated, and this omission would later become the subject of 47 separate internal reviews, 3 of which were still classified at the time of Verath's memoir, was that no one had thought to define the word weapons. The accords used the Keth legal term Vorash asterisk, meaning, in precise Dominion translation, tools designed and primarily employed for the purpose of physical destruction of another sentient being. That was the definition, precise, unambiguous, unassailable by any standard of Dominion jurisprudence. Verath had been confident of this. She was less confident now, looking at the cartridge. "You want to explain that?" she asked the human seated across from her. Not the lead delegate. He was a heavy-set man named Carver who smiled too much and agreed too easily and made Verath feel consistently as though she was missing something. The one she was looking at was the woman beside him, Colonel Adrienne Solis, military attaché according to her title. Her face gave nothing. "Souvenir," Solis said. "Of what?" "Of the last bullet we'll ever need." Verath stared at her for a moment longer than was socially comfortable, a fact she was aware of and did not correct. Then she picked up her documents and called for the compliance review to begin. The review took 11 days. Dominion Inspector Harath 7 and his team of 4 were thorough, methodically thorough, in the way that only a species with 600 years of bureaucratic evolution could manage. They cataloged by category: ballistic systems, energy platforms, kinetic accelerators, chemical dispersal units, biological synthesis facilities. Each facility was assessed, sealed, or dismantled. Each weapon logged against Earth's declared inventory. The numbers matched, every single one. Harath 7 transmitted his confirmation to Verath on the morning of day 12, with a notation that, in retrospect, should have been her first warning rather than her last reassurance. Earth's compliance is complete and without recorded exception. I note, however, that several large manufacturing infrastructure sites were not included in the inspection scope, as they do not fall within the definition of Vorash-class facilities. I have listed them as non-applicable. Recommend no further review. She filed the report, marked the accords fulfilled, sent her acknowledgement to the Dominion Council. On day 13, she received a message from Earth's governing assembly. It was brief, formal, and delivered with the particular tone humans used when they were being excessively polite about something they knew you weren't going to like. In accordance with the ratified disarmament accords, Earth has completed full compliance with the terms of the Keth Dominion's Vorash catalog. We are pleased to confirm that Earth no longer possesses any weapons, as defined under Dominion Treaty law. We look forward to our continued relationship and respectfully request a follow-up liaison session at your earliest convenience. Verath read it 3 times. Then she read it a 4th time, more slowly, paying particular attention to the phrase as defined under Dominion Treaty law. She requested the follow-up session immediately. Carver was already in the chamber when she arrived, 6 minutes early, which was unusual. His smile was present, as always, but it was doing something different today. It was present the way a held breath is present, full of something waiting to be released. Solis was not there. "Where is your military attaché?" Verath asked. "Reassigned," Carver said. "To what?" "Other responsibilities." Verath sat. "Your message referenced compliance as defined under Dominion Treaty law. That phrase was not in the original accords. You added it." "We clarified it." "You qualified it." Carver tilted his head, still smiling. "Is there a difference?" There was a difference. Verath knew there was a difference because she had spent 11 years in Dominion legal arbitration before her appointment as Liaison Prime, and the difference between a clarification and a qualification was the difference between 2 parties agreeing they saw the same thing and one party quietly nodding that they were looking in a different direction. She should have caught it. She hadn't. "What," she said very carefully, "did you not disarm?" Carver folded his hands on the table. He was quiet for a moment that stretched just long enough to make the silence feel deliberate. "That's a very interesting question," he said, "and I'm glad you asked it." The answer was not delivered in that meeting. It was delivered over the next 4 months, in fragments, through incidents the Dominion's monitoring systems logged and flagged and categorized incorrectly. Miscategorized, in fact, in ways that made systematic sense given the assumptions built into the monitoring systems, and which would later turn out to be comprehensively, expensively wrong. The first incident was logged as a geological anomaly. A Dominion surveillance satellite observed a seismic event in the northern reaches of Earth's largest continent, a sharp, focused release of pressure consistent with subsurface collapse. The automated system tagged it as *non-hostile, natural. The monitoring team reviewed it for 40 seconds and moved on. 3 weeks later, there was another one, same signature, different location. Then a third. Verath requested a geological survey. The survey team found no evidence of subsurface instability. They found, instead, what their instruments interpreted as an extremely deep excavation project, tunnels, wide and reinforced and apparently recent, running in directions that didn't align with any mining or infrastructure purpose in Earth's public records. "What are you building?" Verath asked at the next liaison session. "Storage," Carver said. "For what?" "Raw materials." "What kind?" He smiled. "The kind we still have." Here is what Verath understood about human history at that point in the story. And here is where the first misinterpretation calcified into something that would cost the Dominion considerably more than it expected. She understood that humans had evolved in a context of extreme biological competition. She understood that they were prone to conflict, that their civilizational history was a nearly unbroken sequence of wars, that their psychology was structured around threat detection in ways that made other Category 2 species look serene by comparison. She had read the psychological profiles. She had attended the briefings. What she had concluded from this was that humans were dangerous in the way that an untrained animal is dangerous, reactive, impulsive, capable of sudden violence, but not of sustained strategic planning at a level that could threaten a Dominion-managed system. This conclusion was incorrect. She would not know how incorrect for another 3 months. The second incident arrived as a Dominion diplomatic shuttle was passing through near-Earth space on a routine administrative transit. The shuttle's external sensors detected a pattern of objects in low orbit that had not been present 6 weeks prior. Not weapons platforms. The sensors were calibrated to detect those. Not satellites exactly. The objects were too irregular, too varied in their configuration. They registered as debris, or possibly agricultural infrastructure, some kind of large-scale cultivation system, the report suggested, perhaps related to the orbital farming initiatives Earth had mentioned in its economic development filings. The shuttle moved on, filed the report. It was logged under non-hostile developmental. Verath read it on a Tuesday morning and felt, for reasons she could not yet articulate, deeply unsettled. She went back to Carver. "The orbital structures," she said, without greeting or preamble. Carver looked at her. His expression had shifted over the past months. The smile was still there, but underneath it something had changed, something quieter, more careful. He looked at her the way someone looks at a person they respect and are also keeping something important from. "What about them?" he said. "What are they?" "Processing infrastructure." "For what?" A pause, not a long one but long enough. "Minerals," he said. "We have a lot of raw material to process." Verath returned to her office and spent 3 hours reviewing every piece of monitoring data from the past 4 months. She cataloged the geological events, the tunnels, the orbital structures, the increased traffic between Earth's surface and its orbital space. She tried to construct a model of what was happening. The model she built was wrong, but it was wrong in a way that was logical, internally consistent, and almost exactly inverted from the truth. She believed Earth was rebuilding its weapons in secret, that the disarmament had been superficial compliance, and that humans were now engaged in an illicit rearmament program. She brought this theory to the Dominion Council. The Council authorized a secondary inspection. Inspector Harath 7 returned, this time with a team of 12 and a considerably reduced tolerance for Earth's bureaucratic warmth. He reviewed the underground tunnels. He reviewed the orbital structures. He reviewed the raw material processing systems. He found no weapons, not one, not a trace of a projectile, an energy system, a kinetic platform, or anything else that met the Dominion's legal definition of *Vorash. He filed a second confirmation of compliance, this one considerably more confused than the first. "There is nothing here that meets the legal threshold for concern," he transmitted to Verath, "but I am troubled by what I cannot classify. The scale of their infrastructure expansion does not match any developmental model I am familiar with. I am noting a significant increase in a category of facilities that fall outside our assessment parameters. I am not able to identify the purpose of these facilities. They are not weapons. They are not, by any definition I possess, dangerous." He paused in the transmission, and the pause was long enough that it had been clearly recorded. "I cannot tell you what they are," he said. "I can only tell you that they are large." This is the moment, at the center of the story, in the space between what the Dominion thought it understood and what was actually happening, where the whole shape of things changes. Colonel Adrian Solis had not been reassigned to other responsibilities. She had been reassigned to a project that Earth's governing assembly had begun planning 14 years before the Keth Dominion ever made contact. Not because they had known the Dominion was coming. They hadn't. But because in the years following their first detected alien radio signature, a small group of strategic analysts and theoretical military planners had asked a question that no one else wanted to sit with. The question was this: if we are not the first, and if the others are older, and if the pattern of galactic civilization follows any logic at all, then the most likely first contact scenario is not one in which we meet equals. It is one in which we meet someone significantly more powerful than us, who does not consider power imbalance to be a moral problem? From that question, over 14 years, had emerged a planning document. Internally, it was called the Asymmetry Project. In Earth's public records, it didn't exist at all. The Asymmetry Project began from a single foundational premise. If we cannot outgun them, we must become unmanageable. Not dangerous in the conventional sense, not armed, not threatening by any legal or technological definition any external power might apply. Simply unmanageable. A civilization so deeply adapted to loss, so structurally distributed, so embedded in alternatives and redundancies and non-standard methods, that the effort required to control it exceeded any rational cost-benefit calculation. The goal was not to win a war. The goal was to make war pointless. Solis had been put in charge of implementation. And implementation had begun, quietly and comprehensively, 2 years before the Dominion arrived. "You planned for us," Verath said. It was not a question. They were in the liaison chamber again, and this time Carver was alone. No Solis, no aides, no secondary officials. Just the two of them and the table and the light of Earth's sun coming in at a particular angle that made everything look slightly more severe than it actually was. "We planned for contact," Carver said. "We didn't know who would show up." "You planned for a superior power." "We planned for the most likely scenario." Verath was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, if she had looked, she could have seen contrails crossing the sky in patterns that were busier than they'd been 6 months ago. She didn't look. She was watching Carver. "The tunnels," she said. "The orbital structures, the processing facilities." "Yes." "None of them are weapons." "Correct." "Then what are they?" Carver's expression did something she hadn't seen before. The smile was gone. What replaced it was not hostility, not arrogance, something quieter and more difficult to read. Something like patience. The patience of someone who has been carrying a weight for a long time and is choosing, very carefully, how much of it to set down. "They're everything else," he said. "Everything else." It took Verath another 2 weeks of data review, 3 consultations with Dominion strategic analysts, and 1 deeply uncomfortable conversation with a human engineer who had been seconded to the liaison staff, and who answered her questions in a way that was technically complete and emotionally devastating, before she fully understood what that meant. Humans had disarmed, completely, genuinely, by the letter of the Accords. They had surrendered every projectile weapon, every energy discharge platform, every kinetic system. Harath 7's inspections had been accurate. Earth possessed none of those things. What Earth possessed instead was the infrastructure to produce all of them again, at scale, in less time than any Dominion strategic model had allocated as the minimum viable rearmament window. The tunnels were manufacturing precursor storage. The orbital structures were rapid assembly platforms. The processing facilities were materials refinement systems that had been designed. And this was the detail that stopped Verath mid-sentence when she read it. Designed specifically to minimize the signature characteristics that Dominion sensor systems use to identify weapons manufacturing. Not because humans had somehow hacked Dominion technology. They hadn't. Because the Asymmetry Project's planners had looked at the Dominion's published treaty definitions, worked backwards through the logic of what kinds of signatures those definitions implied, and engineered their entire manufacturing infrastructure to exist in the gap between what the definitions covered and what they didn't. They had not hidden weapons. They had hidden the capacity to replace weapons, indefinitely, faster than any foreign power could eliminate them. "It's not a military," the engineer, whose name was Dr. Yusuf Osai and who had the specific quality of seeming genuinely delighted to explain things, told Verath during their consultation. "It's a metabolic system. You can take out the teeth. We grow new teeth. You take out those, we grow more." "How many times?" Verath asked. He tilted his head, considering. "Define times," he said. The Dominion Council received Verath's report on a Wednesday. The full deliberation, typically a 3-day process for matters of this sensitivity, concluded in 11 hours. The conclusion was not what Verath had recommended. She had recommended renegotiation. A new Accords framework, one that covered manufacturing infrastructure, close the gap, expand the legal definition, bring Earth back into compliance with the spirit of the agreement rather than merely the letter. The Council's conclusion was that renegotiation required Earth to agree to renegotiate. Earth declined. Politely, in writing, with 4 pages of legal argument prepared by an international team of human treaty attorneys who had apparently been working on this specific scenario for 18 months, and who had constructed a rebuttal so airtight that the Dominion's own legal division confirmed, after review, that Earth was correct. The existing accords were fulfilled. Earth had complied. No mechanism existed to compel a second round of disarmament for systems that fell outside the original legal definition. Carver delivered the refusal in person, and he had the decency to look genuinely apologetic about it. "We want a good relationship," he said. "We're not trying to be difficult. You designed your entire national infrastructure specifically to avoid our treaty definitions," Verath said. "That is, by any reasonable interpretation, designed to be difficult." "We designed it to be free," Carver said quietly. "There's a difference." She stared at him. He didn't look away. "You were afraid of us," she said. "Not an accusation, a recognition." "We were afraid of what you represented," he said. "Something bigger than us with a defined legal framework that happened to be designed entirely by you. We're not stupid, Liaison Prime. We know what that usually means." What followed was a 6-week period that Dominion internal records categorized as a diplomatic stalemate, and which Earth's internal records categorized, with a certain characteristic human bluntness, as the waiting game. During those 6 weeks, 3 things happened that Verath would later identify as the actual turning points, not the dramatic ones, not the moments that looked like pivots from the outside, but the quiet ones that restructured everything that came afterward. The first was a training exercise. Dominion security forces near Earth conducted a standard readiness drill, simulating rapid response deployment to a surface position. The exercise was not secret. Dominion forces rarely bothered with secrecy near Category 2 worlds, for the same reason that a mountain rarely bothers concealing itself from a stream. The simulation proceeded normally until one of the junior observers noted something in Earth's monitoring traffic. Earth had detected the drill within 19 minutes of its commencement, not through technological surveillance, which the Dominion had expected and accounted for, through civilian radio hobbyists. Dozens of them, independently, using equipment that cost less than a standard Dominion officer's meal allowance, who had noticed the energy signatures and started posting about them in a global communications network that was apparently monitored by automated systems which, in turn, flagged the accumulated data and delivered a summary to Earth's Defense Ministry before the Dominion's own after-action report had been drafted. The Dominion's rapid response window, previously calculated at 4 standard hours, was revised quietly to 40 minutes. The second thing was smaller and, in a way, more frightening. A human researcher at one of Earth's universities published a paper, an academic paper, publicly available, cited by 11 other researchers within a week of publication, about the theoretical vulnerabilities in Dominion sensor array architecture. The paper was mathematical, dense, and almost completely inaccessible to a general audience. It was also correct in several places that it should not have been possible for a Category 2 civilization to correctly identify. The paper was not classified by Earth. It was simply a paper. A human had become curious about something, had worked on it for 3 years apparently for the satisfaction of understanding it, and had then shared the result. When Verath flagged it to the Council's Security Division, their response was a question she found she could not answer. How do we stop them from being curious? The third thing was Solis. Colonel Adrian Solis requested a private meeting with Verath, which was unusual enough that Verath almost declined it out of reflex caution. She agreed, and they met in a small room off the main liaison corridor with no aids, no recording systems, at Solis's request, and 2 cups of coffee that Solis brought herself, handing one to Verath without asking whether she could process it, which was either a cultural oversight or a test, and which Verath didn't touch. "I want to show you something," Solis said. She placed a tablet on the table. On it was a map, not political, not military, geographic, Earth's surface with a series of marked points that Verath didn't immediately recognize. "What am I looking at?" "The asymmetry network, all of it, every node." Solis pushed the tablet slightly closer. "I'm not supposed to be showing you this, to be transparent about that." Verath looked at the map. It was extensive, deeply, uncomfortably extensive, far more so than her own team's best reconstruction. The nodes covered every continent, extended into orbit, appeared to have submarine components, and included several designations she didn't have the context to interpret. "Why are you showing me this?" Solis picked up her coffee, held it, didn't drink. "Because I spent 4 years building this system and I want someone who matters to understand what it actually is." She looked at Verath directly. "It's not aggressive. Every piece of it is reactive. Every piece of it is designed to function specifically when something outside tries to shut it down. The harder you push, the faster it reconstitutes. The nodes are self-referencing. You can't take it apart from the outside because there is no outside. You'd have to come inside, which means you'd have to be here on the ground, which means a ground campaign," Verath said. "Which means 7 billion people who have known their whole lives that something like this was coming," Solis said quietly, "and who have been angry about it the whole time." Silence. Verath looked at the map. "You're not showing me this as a threat," she said slowly. "No. You're showing me this as a negotiating position." "I'm showing you this," Solis said, "because I think you're smart enough to take it back to the right people and explain that we are not a problem that has a military solution. And I'd rather you understand that before someone on your side decides to find out the hard way." Verath took it back. The briefing she delivered to the Dominion Council 2 weeks later was the longest of her career. It covered the asymmetry network, the manufacturing infrastructure, the sensor coverage, the academic publication rate on Dominion vulnerabilities. That last figure had risen, in the 11 weeks since the first paper, to 23 separate publications from 9 different institutions, and the psychographic assessment her team had assembled on the human population at large. The psychographic assessment was the part that landed hardest. Humans, her team had concluded, did not fight the way other species fought. Other species fought to achieve an objective and then stopped, surrendered, withdrew, negotiated, integrated some calculation of cost versus benefit that eventually produced an equilibrium. Humans fought that way too, when the objective was clear and the cost was predictable. But when they perceived the fight as being about their fundamental autonomy, their ability to exist without external control, the cost-benefit calculation failed to produce an equilibrium. The data was historical and overwhelming. Human populations under occupation did not integrate into equilibrium. They persisted, for generations, across timescales that other species found literally incomprehensible as a psychological commitment. One of the council members interrupted her. "What is the theoretical endpoint?" he asked. "If we pursued conventional compliance enforcement, what is the projected termination point of human resistance?" Verath looked at her notes. She had asked her team this specific question. She had asked them to be precise. "Their models didn't produce a termination point," she said. A long silence. "The models didn't converge." "The models converged," she said. They converged on an answer of unresolvable within any time horizon we can model. The team noted that human historical resistance patterns in comparable scenarios. She paused, because even saying this felt strange. Have a documented duration exceeding the current age of the Dominion's political system. Another silence, longer this time. They've done this before, a different council member asked, against comparable power differentials. Against differentials that, in relative terms, exceeded ours. She let that sit. Against forces that occupied their territory, against forces that held every material advantage, against circumstances in which rational calculation of survival probability should have produced capitulation. They did not capitulate. The occupying force eventually concluded that the cost of continued suppression exceeded any strategic value the occupation provided and withdrew. She closed her notes. This is not a species that calculates whether it can win, she said. This is a species that calculates whether it can continue, and their answer in every historical case we examined has been yes. The council deliberated for 9 days. Verath was not included in those deliberations, which told her something about how seriously the council was taking the matter. On the 10th day, she was called back. The council's position had shifted, not dramatically. The Dominion did not make dramatic shifts, but measurably, meaningfully. The language of the new directive was softer. The enforcement mechanisms were reframed. The timeline was extended. And for the first time since the Accords, a phrase appeared in Dominion documentation that had not appeared before: reciprocal framework. Not a directive, not a notification, a proposal. Conditional, hedged, phrased in the particular way that Dominion legal language used when it wanted to leave room for the other party to feel that it had agency in the outcome. Carver read the directive and looked at Verath across the table with an expression she still couldn't quite classify. They want to negotiate, he said. They want to propose a framework, Verath said. There is a difference, yes. The smile was back, but it was different now. Tired maybe, or older. Tell them yes, tell them we'd welcome it. He stood and then he stopped. Tell me something, he said, honestly. I'll try. Did you ever actually think this was going to go the way you planned it? Verath considered the question. She thought about the cartridge on the table, 17 days before the Accords were signed. The last bullet they'd ever need. She thought about the manufacturing nodes underground and in orbit, and the tunnels, and the amateur radio hobbyists who had detected a Dominion security drill before the Dominion's own systems had fully processed it, and 23 academic papers, and Solis showing her a map she wasn't supposed to see, handing her a cup of coffee she couldn't drink. No, she said, I don't think any of us understood what we were doing. Carver nodded slowly. That's honest, he said. I'll give you that. The framework negotiations took 14 months. They were not easy, and they were not clean, and the agreement that emerged from them bore almost no resemblance to the original Accords in tone or structure. It was collaborative in a way that Dominion documentation almost never was, and it contained, buried in subsection 7 of Annex 3, a clause that Verath had fought for personally and without full authorization from the Council, and which she suspected she would eventually answer for. The clause specified that any future treaty definitions would be developed jointly, with equal representation from both parties, and that any definition applied to Earth's sovereignty must also be applied reciprocally to Dominion practices within Earth's legal jurisdiction. It was, by any measure, a remarkable concession for a Category 2 world to have extracted from the Dominion. The human treaty team didn't celebrate. Solis, who attended the signing as one of Earth's official witnesses, stood quietly at the back of the room and watched the document being formalized with an expression that Verath had come to recognize as distinctly human, a kind of contained, private satisfaction that was careful not to show itself fully, as if the people who had earned a thing were constitutionally reluctant to acknowledge that they had earned it. After the signing, as the formal ceremony dissolved into the low hum of post-agreement conversation, Solis crossed the room and stood beside Verath. Not approaching, not initiating, just standing in proximity. It was a thing humans did, Verath had noticed. They created closeness through physical space in ways that were quiet and deniable. After a moment, Solis said, "You fought for the reciprocal clause." "Yes. That's going to cost you with the council." "Probably." A pause. "Why?" Solis asked. Verath looked at the signed document on the table. She thought about 14 months of negotiations, and a psychographic assessment that hadn't produced a termination point, and a map she had memorized and then put away, and a brass cartridge the size of her smallest digit positioned at the center of a conference table like a gift or a message. "Because you were right," she said. "You're not a problem with a military solution. The sooner the Dominion has to operate under rules it wrote with you, the sooner it understands that." She paused. "And because I would rather have a framework that works than be right about who holds the advantage." Solis was quiet for a moment. "You know that most of the asymmetry network is still in place." "I know. Even with the new accords." "I know that too. And—" Verath picked up her document case. "And I think that may be the most sensible thing your species has ever done," she said. "Don't let anyone talk you out of it." She left before Solis could respond. Behind her, she heard a sound she had come to associate with human relief. A long, quiet exhale, barely audible. The kind of sound a person makes when they have been holding something difficult for a very long time and finally find, to their own surprise, that they don't have to hold it alone. The Dominion's official history of the disarmament accords, published 6 years later, described the outcome as a successful diplomatic resolution with mutual benefits. It did not mention the psychographic assessment. It did not mention the 14-month framework negotiations, or the reciprocal clause, or the manufacturing network that had been built to replace every surrendered weapon faster than any external force could eliminate it. It did not mention Hareth Seven's note about something large he could not classify. It did not mention the cartridge. Verath's memoir, published privately, never officially endorsed, widely circulated in the corridors where the people who made Dominion policy tended to read things they officially hadn't read, described it differently. The last page contained a single observation that became, in certain circles, something close to a foundational text for how the Dominion's younger generation thought about the species on the small, loud, biologically overcrowded planet that had signed an arms treaty and remained, somehow, exactly as dangerous as before. "We arrived believing we were educators," she wrote. "We left having been educated. The lesson was not about weapons, had surrendered those, genuinely and without deception. The lesson was about what weapons are for, and whether a species that has looked at a larger, better-armed power and decided to remain itself is a species that can be managed at all. We defined their armaments. We never thought to define their will. In hindsight, I am not certain will is something our legal architecture is capable of defining. It may simply not be something that fits in a treaty. We asked them to disarm. They did. And the day they handed over the last cartridge, they became more dangerous than they had ever been with weapons in their hands, because we walked away thinking the problem was solved, and they walked away knowing that the problem for them had only just clarified into something they understood how to survive. I have reviewed the asymmetry network files many times. I have looked at the nodes, the redundancies, the reconstitution timelines, the amateur radio operators who detected our drills, the papers published by people who were simply curious. I have tried to find the limit of it, the point at which the system would fail, the threshold beyond which human persistence became human exhaustion. I have not found it. I do not think it exists. The Keth Dominion has managed 12 civilizations into compliance. We have absorbed 7 species into the framework of our institutional order. We are 600 years old, and we have never, in 600 years, encountered a Category 2 civilization that looked at our legal definitions and asked what was missing from them. They were not the strongest species we had ever met. They were the only species we had ever met that read the contract.